Captain Emily Carter had never been the kind of pilot who drew admiring stares when she walked into a briefing room. She wasn't the one with polished flight boots, aviator sunglasses hanging at her chest, or a cocky grin that announced to the world she belonged in a fighter jet. She didn't have the swagger of the F-16 or F-35 pilots, the ones who strutted through the hallways as if every step was an encore after a dazzling air show. Emily belonged to a quieter tribe, one that rarely found its stories splashed across recruitment posters or Hollywood blockbusters. She was a C-130 Hercules pilot, tasked with missions that most of the military brass categorized as support. To outsiders, that word carried weight. It sounded essential, dependable. But inside the ranks, support was code for unglamorous, invisible. Support wasn't where legends were born. Support was where logistics lived. And Emily Carter was very good at logistics. Her aircraft, the C-130, wasn't sleek or fast. Nicknamed the Herc, it looked bulky, with broad wings and a nose that always seemed to be frowning. It wasn't built to win dogfights or streak past radar. It was built to endure, to haul tons of supplies, to drop cargo from impossible heights into impossible places, to carry soldiers into the teeth of danger and carry them out again. Emily loved the machine for what it was, stubborn, resilient, and utterly reliable. She often said the Herc had a personality. It was the kind of plane that would creak and groan, but never quit. Like an old farm truck that just refuses to die, her co-pilot once joked. But in the hierarchy of pilots, she knew where she stood. She'd see the way the fighter jocks nodded politely when she introduced herself. They respected her professionalism. Yes, but she could feel the unspoken hierarchy humming in the air. They were the hunters, the warriors in sleek machines that bent physics. She was the bus driver. That was the label. And while no one said it directly to her face, she'd overheard enough jokes in mess halls and hangars to know what many thought. She's good solid stick, dependable. Yeah, but she's just transport. It always ended there. Emily had grown up hearing similar dismissals, though never from her parents. Her father, a retired pilot himself, had instilled in her a love for flight before she could even ride a bike. He had flown Hueys in Vietnam and crop dusters across Nebraska farmland. He was the first to put a control yoke in her hands, his weathered fingers guiding hers. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had encouraged her fiercely, telling her that determination could bend even the stiffest winds. But outside her family, there were always doubters. In flight school, she was one of only a handful of women. She learned early how to tune out the raised eyebrows, the whispered doubts. She buried herself in discipline, in precision, in proving every assumption wrong. If she wasn't flashy, she would be perfect. If she wasn't celebrated, she would be undeniable. Still, perfection didn't silence invisibility. On base at Norfolk, Virginia, her days followed a rhythm. Wake before dawn, pre-flight checks, missions that blurred into one another, delivering pallets of ammunition to Marines in training, ferrying medical equipment across the country, moving humanitarian aid when hurricanes tore through coastal towns. She loved the work, even if it didn't sparkle. There was pride in knowing that the gears of the military machine turned because of pilots like her. But there were nights, late in her small apartment off base, when she wondered if this was how her story would always read. Competent, reliable, forgettable, the turning point, or at least the first tremor before it came during a joint exercise with Navy SEALs. Emily had been assigned to fly their gear into a remote airstrip in the Carolinas. As she walked across the tarmac, clipboard in hand, she noticed a tall man with a severe haircut and an even more severe gaze standing apart from the others. Carried himself with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. Commander James Rourke. She recognized him immediately. His reputation preceded him. Rourke was the kind of leader whose name was spoken with respect even outside the SEALs. He had led missions in Afghanistan, Somalia, and other places that never made the evening news. Emily had seen his photo in briefings, his file tagged with words like strategic asset and high value. Their paths crossed briefly that day. He gave her a nod as he loaded his men's equipment, and she returned it. That was it, no words, no conversation. But even in that small exchange, Emily noticed something. Unlike others, he didn't dismiss her. His nod was curt, but it carried weight, as though he acknowledged her presence, her role. That small recognition lingered with her longer than she expected. Later, over coffee in the mess hall, she overheard two fighter pilots joking about bus drivers. One laughed, "You know, the only time you notice them is if your luggage gets lost." Emily forced a smile, but inwardly, the sting was sharp. She wondered what Rourke would have said if he'd heard them. Somehow, she suspected he wouldn't have laughed. For weeks afterward, she thought about that nod. Strange, she mused, how a small gesture could feel like validation. But the truth was, deep down, Emily was hungry. Hungry for a chance to show what she could do. Hungry for something beyond invisible competence. That chance was coming. She didn't know it yet, but history had a way of finding the quiet ones. And soon, the quiet pilot no one noticed would fly into the heart of fire and change everything. The morning broke with a haze of humidity clinging to the Norfolk base, the kind that made flight suits stick to the skin before engines even spun up. Captain Emily Carter moved with her usual calm precision, clipboard in hand, double-checking manifests and signatures. On paper, today's assignment was nothing unusual, a routine supply mission into a forward-deployed base in the Middle East. She'd flown this run, or something nearly identical, countless times. Routine, that word, always lingered around her. Missions like a shadow. Still, Emily approached the task the same way she always did, with meticulous attention to detail. Her C-130 Hercules had been inspected the night before, but she walked the fuselage again, running her hand along its skin as though feeling for anything the checklists might have missed. Her crew lieutenant Jensen, her young co-pilot and master. Sergeant Ruiz, her loadmaster, watched her silently, accustomed to her rituals. Emily believed an aircraft could sense whether its pilot respected it. And respect, to her, meant treating every mission as if it carried the fate of lives, not just crates. This time, though, there was a difference. Her cargo wasn't just ammunition, rations, and medical kits. Among the pallets stacked inside the dim belly of the plane were specialized equipment cases marked for SEAL team deployment and riding. Aboard her flight, in the jump seats bolted along the fuselage walls, were members of Commander James Rourke's team. Emily didn't let her face show it, but the sight of them gave her pause. SEALs had a reputation that bordered on myth within. The armed forces. They were ghosts operators who slipped in and out of places too dangerous for anyone else, whose missions were whispered about, but rarely detailed. To have them on her aircraft elevated the stakes of what otherwise would have been another nameless supply run. Rourke himself was there, seated near the rear, helmet resting on his knees. He seemed utterly at ease, as though the thunderous machine around him was a quiet park bench. His eyes, cold and analytical, occasionally swept the space, but mostly he sat still, conserving energy. Emily caught his gaze only once as she entered the cockpit. He gave the same nod as before, brief, acknowledging nothing more. But somehow it anchored her. "Cleared for takeoff, Captain Carter," came the tower's voice over her headset. "Copy that," she replied, hands steady on the yoke. Engines roared, the Herc rolled forward, and in seconds they were airborne, clawing into the hazy sky. The hours passed in the steady hum of propellers. Inside the cockpit, Emily monitored instruments with unwavering focus, while Jensen handled radio traffic. Ruiz occasionally checked in from the cargo bay, where the SEALs sat in silence. They were different from other passengers she'd carried. No nervous chatter, no restless movements. They waited like statues, each man sunk into his own mental preparation. Halfway across the ocean, Jensen leaned closer. "Hard to believe guys like that exist," he whispered. Emily didn't answer right away. She'd spent years brushing against the edges of heroism flying soldiers into war zones, carrying wounded back home, but she had never seen combat the way those men had. To her, they embodied the part of the military world she wasn't allowed to touch. Where she hauled supplies, they made history. But she wondered, for the briefest second, what if circumstances changed? Their arrival into the Middle East base was smooth at first. The desert stretched wide and merciless beneath them, dust storms curling across the horizon like bruises. Emily guided the Hercules onto the cracked runway of a forward operating base, its control tower a skeletal structure bristling with antennas. As the wheels screeched against asphalt, she felt that familiar satisfaction of delivering people and cargo exactly where they needed to be. Engines wound down, the ramp lowered, and the SEALs rose in unison. Rourke paused at the foot of the ramp, glanced back once just for a second, then disappeared into the heat with his men. Cargo delivered. Ruiz confirmed with a grin. Another day, another paycheck. But Emily didn't share his lightness. Something about the way Rourke looked back unsettled her. It wasn't gratitude. It was something sharper, heavier. A silent awareness that this wasn't just another day. She shook it off. Maybe she was reading too much into it. The base commander briefed them quickly. Insurgent activity had spiked in the region. Supply convoys had been hit, and a coalition patrol had gone missing the week before. The SEALs were tasked with cutting into the insurgents' network, locating a command cell, rumored to be hiding deep in the mountains. It wasn't her mission. Emily reminded herself of that as she refueled, logged her paperwork, and prepared for the return flight. Her part was finished. She wasn't here to fight insurgents or rescue captured soldiers. She was here to move boxes. Yet, as she sat in the cockpit, waiting for clearance to depart, she couldn't shake the sense that the air itself felt charged. "Something wrong, Captain?" Jensen asked, noticing her hesitation. "No," she said quickly. "Just something feels off." She didn't elaborate, because she couldn't explain it. It wasn't in the weather, or the instruments, or the chatter on the radio. It was instinct. The same instinct that had saved her more than once during tricky low altitude runs in stormy conditions. The same instinct her father used to call the sixth sense of a pilot. That night, while Emily's Hercules cut back across the skies toward Norfolk, the ambush came. Rourke's team had moved swiftly into the mountains, tracking their target. Through ravines and villages, where the line between civilian and insurgent blurred. But intelligence had been compromised. A convoy of insurgents armed with heavy weapons lay in wait, and when the SEALs crossed a narrow pass, the valley exploded with fire. RPGs streaked across the night sky, rifles cracked, and chaos swallowed. The unit, by dawn, fragments of information reached the base. Several SEALs were confirmed dead, others were missing, and Commander Rourke, by all reports, had been captured alive. The news rippled through the base like a shockwave. Emily heard it over the radio the moment she landed at Norfolk. She froze, headset halfway off, listening as fragments of words spilled through the static. SEAL commander taken? Heavy casualties, enemy movement. Jensen swore under his breath. Rue looked pale. Emily just sat still, the words sinking into her like cold water. She had never spoken to Rourke, not beyond a nod. She didn't know his story, beyond the legends whispered in hangars. But she remembered the way he had looked back at her before walking off the ramp, as if he'd known something she didn't. And now he was gone, dragged into the hands of men who wouldn't hesitate to use him as a pawn, a bargaining chip, or worse. Emily told herself it wasn't her problem. She was a transport pilot. Her job ended when the cargo left her plane. The fight belonged to others. But as she walked back across the tarmac, she couldn't shake the words that had haunted her career. Just a transport pilot. For the first time, the phrase didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like a challenge. And Emily Carter, against all odds, was about to answer it. The news arrived in fragments, scattered through static-filled transmissions and whispered updates in dimly lit operations rooms. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Commander James Rook, that James Rook wasn't the kind of man who got captured. He was the SEAL commander others pointed to as proof of what the teams could achieve. If he and his men were in the field, odds shifted. That was the reputation. But reality didn't care about reputation. The ambush in the mountains had been brutal, calculated. Insurgents had set their trap in a narrow pass, lined with jagged cliffs, a kill zone impossible to retreat from. The SEALs had fought like wolves cornered, but numbers and firepower had overwhelmed them. By dawn, 7 SEALs lay dead. 3 had vanished in the chaos. And Commander Rourke, bloodied but alive, had been dragged into the back of a truck and disappeared into the desert. On base, the atmosphere turned heavy, suffocating. Emily Carter heard the official briefing 2 hours after her return to Norfolk. She sat in the corner of a crowded operations room, not because she belonged there. Transport pilots rarely did, but because she had insisted on listening. She wanted to hear it for herself, not through second-hand whispers. The commander at the podium delivered the words with clinical detachment. Commander Rourke is confirmed alive. Intelligence suggests he is being moved to a secure insurgent compound in the Chirac Valley. Hostile presence in the area is high. Immediate rescue attempts are considered untenable at this time. Emily's hands tightened around her notepad. Until the edges crumpled. Immediate rescue attempts untenable. That phrase translated into something she knew too well. We can't get him back. Not yet, maybe not ever. The room buzzed with quiet conversations. Fighter pilots exchanged frustrated glances. Intelligence officers scribbled notes. Emily remained silent, her mind racing. She replayed the last time she'd seen Rourke seated, calmly in the back of her aircraft, helmet in his lap, eyes scanning his men. He hadn't looked invincible, but he had looked certain. Certain of his mission, certain of his team, certain of survival. To think of that certainty being stripped. Away in a dusty cell, somewhere made Emily's stomach twist. After the briefing, Jensen caught up to her in the hallway. "Captain, you okay?" Emily forced a nod. "Yeah, just processing." But she wasn't okay. She felt something unfamiliar rising inside her, a sense of responsibility that didn't make logical sense. Rourke hadn't been her mission. She hadn't been on the ground when the ambush happened. And yet, she couldn't shake the thought that her story was somehow tied to his. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in hostile territory, Rourke woke to pain. His wrists were bound, his vision blurred from a blow to the head. He could taste blood on his tongue. The back of the truck jolted over uneven ground, each bump driving a spike of agony through his ribs. Around him, armed men shouted in a language he only half understood. He forced his breathing steady. Panic was useless. Panic got men killed. Rourke's mind cataloged details even as his body screamed. He counted 6 captors in the truck, at least 2 more in vehicles ahead. He noted the direction of the sun, the terrain slipping by dry scrubland, giving way to rocky foothills. He couldn't see his surviving men, but he prayed they were alive somewhere in the convoy. The mission had gone to hell fast. They'd underestimated the enemy's intelligence. Someone had tipped them off. Rourke filed that thought away for later. For now, survival was the only mission. His captors shoved him against the truck bed as they climbed higher into the mountains. Eventually, the convoy stopped at a walled compound carved from stone, its gates reinforced with steel scavenged from wreckage. Rourke was dragged out, shoved to his knees in the dirt. A tall man emerged from the compound, face covered, eyes sharp with triumph. The way the others deferred to him marked him as the leader. "Commander Rourke," the man said in accented English, his tone almost mocking. "The Americans will pay a great price to see you again." Rourke stared back. Silent, he wouldn't give him the satisfaction of fear. Back in Norfolk, Emily spent the night restless, lying awake in her small apartment. The words from the briefing echoed in her mind. Untenable, secure compound, hostile presence. She pictured Rourke bound in some dark cell. She pictured the SEALs she had carried being interrogated, tortured, or worse. She knew how these situations unfolded. Sometimes the military waited. Negotiations dragged. Intelligence trickled in too slowly. And men like Rourke disappeared forever into the black hole of conflict. The thought burned. Emily rose before dawn and returned to base, driven by something she couldn't quite name. When she walked into the operations center, she found senior officers huddled around a map of the Chirac Valley. Lines traced possible routes, all marked with red circles, threat zones. She stood quietly at the back, listening. The rescue options were being discussed, but every suggestion ended with the same phrase: too dangerous. Too much risk. Finally, Emily spoke. What about low-altitude insertion? Using terrain to mask radar? Heads turned. One colonel frowned. "Captain Carter, this is not your arena." She held his gaze. "With respect, sir, it is. You won't get fighters in low enough without drawing fire. But a C-130, flown right, can use the valleys for cover. I've done terrain following drops in worse conditions. I can get a team in close enough." Silence followed. Someone scoffed quietly. "She's just a transport pilot." The words landed like a slap. Emily felt heat rise in her chest, but she didn't back down. "I know what you think. But you need precision. You need low. You need fast. You need someone who can fly that machine like it was built for this. That's me." The colonel opened his mouth to dismiss her again, but another voice interrupted. "She's not wrong." All eyes turned to a gray-haired general at the table. He studied Emily for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "We'll consider it." Dismissed. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. For Emily, it was a crack in the wall. Later that night, she sat in the cockpit of her Hercules, engine silent, the cabin dim. She ran her hands over the controls, whispering almost like a prayer. She had flown this aircraft through storms, through night skies so black the horizon vanished, through turbulence that rattled bones. But this would be different. This wouldn't be delivering boxes. This would be delivering men into the jaws of fire, and maybe pulling them back out again. Her father's voice echoed in memory. "Sometimes you don't choose the fight chooses you." Emily Carter had never gone looking for glory. She had never asked to be a hero. But as she sat there in the stillness, she realized the fight had chosen her. And somewhere in the Chirac Valley, Commander James Rourke was waiting for anyone to come. The air in the operations building felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of the decisions being made inside. Captain Emily Carter sat in the corner of the conference room, eyes fixed on the projection screen where satellite images of the Chirac Valley flickered. Jagged mountain ranges cut across the screen like scars, valleys dipping into shadows where enemy compounds were hidden. The colonels and generals argued quietly among themselves. Every possible plan ended with too many risks. Rourke's location had been narrowed to a fortified compound on the valley's eastern edge, but it was a hornet's nest armed checkpoints, anti-aircraft emplacements, and hostile patrols scattered throughout the region. Any rescue team would have to get in undetected, fight their way out, and somehow survive extraction. Fighter jets couldn't fly low enough to insert troops without being tracked. Helicopters didn't have the range or the speed to evade. That left one option, and Emily knew it, the Hercules. She waited until the conversation reached another dead end before standing. Her heart hammered, but her voice came steady. "With respect, gentlemen, I can get a team in there." The room went quiet. A colonel in crisp blues raised an eyebrow. "Captain, this isn't a supply drop. This is combat." "I understand," Emily replied evenly. "But I've flown terrain-hugging runs through mountains in pitch-black conditions. The Hercules can carry a full rescue team and their gear. I can use the valleys as cover, avoid radar, and bring them close enough to strike." Another officer scoffed. "That's fantasy. The C-130 wasn't built for combat insertions." Emily locked eyes with him. "It wasn't built to land on dirt strips the size of a football field either, but we do it. It wasn't built to fly below radar nets, but we've adapted. The question isn't what the aircraft was designed for. The question is what its pilot can make it do." The silence that followed wasn't dismissive this time. It was thoughtful. The gray-haired general from the day before leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Captain Carter, you realize what you're proposing puts you and your crew in extreme danger." "Yes, sir." "And you'd volunteer anyway?" Emily hesitated only for a breath. "Yes, sir." The general studied her, as if searching for cracks. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. Draft the plan. Let's see if it's as good as your conviction." Later, in the hangar, Emily gathered her crew. Jensen, her young co-pilot, stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You're saying we're flying straight into an insurgent stronghold? At night? With no escort?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Emily replied. "Ma'am, forgive me, but that's insane." "Master." Sergeant Ruiz, the loadmaster, leaned back against a pallet. "Crazy doesn't mean wrong," he muttered. "She's right, nobody else can get close enough." Jensen's voice rose. "We're a cargo crew, Captain. We're not trained for combat." Emily took a step closer, her tone firm but calm. "We don't have to fight. We just have to fly. Our job is to get the team in, keep this bird steady under fire, and get them back out. That's all." "That's all?" Jensen repeated, incredulous. "That's suicide." Emily softened. Her tone. "I won't force you. If you want to bow out, I'll respect it. But if we don't do this, Rourke is gone. Maybe for good. And if that happens, it'll be because we stayed safe while others died trying." Jensen's jaw tightened. "He didn't answer right away." Finally, he muttered, "Hell, if you're going, I'm not staying behind." Emily nodded once. She didn't thank him. Gratitude felt out of place. What she felt was resolve. The next days blurred into relentless preparation. Emily pored over maps and satellite imagery until the lines blurred. She traced valleys, memorized elevations, calculated altitudes to the foot. Every ridge, every bend in the terrain had to be etched into her mind. She flew simulator runs late into the night, practicing low-altitude maneuvers, sudden dives, steep climbs. Again and again, she rehearsed flying into the valley, dropping to 50 feet above the ground, then pulling up just in time to avoid jagged peaks. Her crew trained alongside her. Ruiz drilled emergency procedures. What to do if hydraulic systems failed, if engines were hit, if the landing gear collapsed on rough terrain. Jensen learned to monitor terrain following radar while keeping communications clear under chaos. They weren't a combat crew, not officially, but Emily was turning them into one. At one point, Ruiz caught her alone near the plane. "Why you, Captain? You could have stayed out of this. Nobody would have blamed you." Emily paused, staring at the Hercules silhouetted against the floodlights. "Because I'm tired of being invisible. Tired of being the one who just drowns the boxes while others do the real work. This is my fight as much as anyone's now." Ruiz studied her for a long moment before nodding. "And let's make sure we win it." On the fourth night, the SEAL rescue team arrived. 12 men in dark gear, their faces hidden, their movements precise. They boarded the Hercules quietly, their gear already packed for war. Emily watched them file past, her eyes searching for one man who wasn't their Rourke. The thought of him somewhere out there, waiting, fueled her resolve. One of the SEALs, a broad-shouldered operator named Hayes, stopped at the cockpit. "You're the pilot?" "Yes." He studied her for a beat. "Heard you volunteered." "That's right." Hayes gave a curt nod. "Then we'll trust you to get us there. We'll do the rest." It wasn't praise, but it was enough. Before departure, Emily found herself alone for a moment, sitting in the silent cockpit. She ran her fingers over the throttle levers, the worn grips of the yoke. She whispered softly, almost like a prayer. "All right, old girl. They don't believe in us, but we know what we can do. Let's bring them home." Memories of her father surfaced, his gravelly voice, his steady hand on hers the first time she'd flown. "Sometimes you don't choose the fight chooses you." She closed her eyes, breathed deep, and opened them again. The weight of fear was there, heavy, pressing, but beneath it was something stronger, determination. This was no longer about being overlooked. It was about proving that every pilot, every aircraft, every so-called support mission mattered. It was about showing that she wasn't just a transport pilot. She was the only chance Commander James Rourke had left. When the night of the mission came, the base was hushed, lights dimmed, radios crackling softly. The Hercules sat on the runway like a waiting beast, its 4 engines idling low, propellers spinning in blurred circles. Emily climbed into the cockpit, Jensen sliding into the seat beside her, Ruiz strapping in behind. The SEAL team secured, their gear in silence. "Checklist complete," Jensen murmured, his voice tight with nerves. Emily's hands moved over the controls, steady as stone. "Tower, this is Reaper 1 requesting clearance." "Reaper 1, you are cleared. Good hunting." The engines roared, the aircraft surged forward, and as the wheels lifted off the runway, Emily felt the shift deep in her chest. No more training, no more rehearsals. They were stepping into the fire. The night was moonless, the kind of darkness that swallowed light and erased horizons. Over the Afghan mountains, the stars glittered sharp and cold, but down in the valleys, shadows consumed everything. For Captain Emily Carter, that darkness was both enemy and shield. The Hercules thundered forward at 23,000 feet, invisible to radar for now, but soon to drop lower. In the cockpit, the glow of the instrument panel bathed Emily and her co-pilot Jensen in pale green. Every dial, every digital readout hummed with life. "ETA to descent point, 6 minutes, Jensen said, his voice clipped. Emily nodded, eyes never leaving the forward display. "Copy. Hold steady." Behind them, the SEALs sat strapped in, silent as stone. Hayes, their team leader, checked his gear one last time. Guns loaded, safeties flicked, radios tuned. Each man knew what awaited them, an armed compound. Commander Rourke possibly inside, dozens of enemies between him and freedom. Emily inhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate. This was it. The moment all the late nights of planning, all the training runs, had led to. "Reaper 1, this is Eagle Command," the radio crackled. "Be advised, enemy movement detected near your target zone. Increased patrols. Do you copy? Emily grabbed the mic. Reaper 1 copies. Proceeding as planned. Jensen shot her a look. Increased patrols? That's not good. When is it ever? Emily muttered. She adjusted the throttle, her hand firm on the lever. Strap in. We're going low. The descent was brutal. The Hercules, a beast of an aircraft, wasn't built for weaving through mountains like a fighter jet. But Emily coaxed it down, angling hard, throttling back, her eyes darting between radar, altimeter, and the black void through the windshield. The terrain following radar screamed warnings as jagged peaks loomed ahead. Emily ignored them, trusting her instincts, trusting the map she'd memorized. Altitude 1,200 feet, 900, 600. Jensen's voice pitched higher as the ground rushed closer. Relax, Emily said calmly, though her palms slicked with sweat. She'll hold. At 200 feet, Emily leveled out, the Hercules skimming the valley floor like a massive shadow. The ridges above towered, hiding them from radar. One wrong move, one fraction of a second too late, and they'd be shredded against rock. The SEALs gripped their harnesses, some bowing their heads briefly in silent prayer. Ruiz muttered over the intercom, flying a C-130 through a canyon at night. Never thought I'd see the day. Emily's voice was steady. Welcome to the impossible. Enemy radar scanned the skies above, but the Hercules slipped beneath, hugging the earth like a ghost. Emily threaded the valleys with surgical precision, muscles tense, eyes wide, brain firing calculations faster than she thought possible. Checkpoint Alpha passed, Jensen reported. 4 minutes to target zone. Then a sharp alarm. Missile lock. Jensen shouted. Emily's heart lurched. She yanked the yoke left, banking hard. The Hercules groaned in protest, engine straining as she shoved the throttle. A streak of fire sliced the sky behind them. A shoulder-fired missile launched from a ridge. Flares now, Emily barked. Ruiz slammed the switch. Bursts of white-hot flares erupted from the aircraft, trailing like falling stars. The missile veered, chasing heat, and exploded harmlessly in the distance. The SEALs barely moved, faces grim but unflinching. For them, chaos was expected. For Emily, this was survival on the edge of impossibility. Finally, the valley widened. Ahead lay the drop zone, a flat stretch of dirt road 1/2 mile from the compound. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even safe. But it was all they had. Approaching DZ, Jensen said, voice taut. Emily steadied her breathing. All right, people. This is it. Ruiz opened the ramp. In the back, hydraulic motors whined as the massive rear ramp lowered. Cold night air tore into the fuselage, whipping past the SEALs. One by one, they unbuckled, rifles slung, faces unreadable behind their night vision goggles. Hayes stepped to the edge, the wind howling around him. He looked back once toward the cockpit. Emily met his gaze in the rear-view mirror. A wordless exchange passed between them. Trust. Then he gave the signal. The SEALs leapt into the darkness. Emily pulled the Hercules up sharply, engines roaring as the aircraft clawed back into the night sky. Team away, Ruiz confirmed. Emily exhaled, her shoulders tight. The first half of their mission was complete. But now came the hardest part, staying alive long enough to bring the SEALs back. On the ground, Hayes and his men vanished into the shadows, moving like phantoms toward the compound. Emily circled miles away, invisible but listening to every scrap of radio chatter. Minutes crawled. Then, gunfire. Sharp, rapid, unmistakable. Contact. Hayes's voice crackled over the secure channel. We're in. Emily tightened her grip on the yoke. She wanted to ask about Rourke, wanted to know if he was alive, but she couldn't risk breaking their focus. All she could do was wait, circling in the darkness, engines humming like a predator's growl. Command, this is Reaper 1. she whispered into the mic. Team is engaged, holding for exfil. Copy, Reaper 1, Eagle Command replied. Stay sharp. Intel shows multiple enemy vehicles mobilizing toward the compound. You may have company soon. Her stomach nodded. Understood. On the ground, the fight raged. Bursts of automatic fire echoed faintly, even from miles away. Explosions lit the horizon, flashes of orange against the black sky. Emily pictured Hayes and his team breaching walls, cutting down guards, searching room to room. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, Hayes's voice erupted over the radio. Reaper 1, we have him. Repeat, we have Rourke. Preparing for exfil. Relief surged through Emily, so strong it nearly broke her composure. She closed her eyes briefly, whispered, Hold on, Commander. But Hayes wasn't finished. Be advised, enemy reinforcements inbound. We're going to be hot. Be ready to pick us up under fire. Emily's heart pounded. This was the moment that separated transport pilots from warriors. Copy that. Mark the LZ. I'll bring her in. As the Hercules banked back toward the valley, Jensen's voice shook. Ma'am, you can't land there. It's too short, too rough. We'll never get back out. Emily's eyes were steel. We don't have a choice. A dirt road loomed ahead, barely visible. She dropped altitude fast, engines straining. The aircraft bucked in turbulence, but Emily fought it, guiding the lumbering beast down. Landing gear down. The Hercules slammed onto the dirt, bouncing once, twice, before screeching to a halt in a storm of dust. Emily wrestled the yoke, bringing it under control. Ramp open, she shouted. The SEALs burst from the tree line, Rourke among them limping, bloodied, but alive. Emily's chest constricted at the sight, but there was no time for emotion. Enemy gunfire cracked across the night, bullets pinging against the fuselage. Move! Move! Hayes roared as his men sprinted up the ramp. Ruiz fired suppressive bursts from the side hatch, covering them. The SEALs piled inside, dragging Rourke with them. His eyes flicked toward the cockpit just for a second, locking with Emily's. She looked back, unflinching. Then Hayes shouted, We're on! Go, go, go. Emily shoved the throttle forward. Engines roared, the Hercules lurching down the dirt strip as tracer fire streaked past. The ground shook under enemy vehicles closing in. Mortar shells burst nearby, shockwaves rattling the aircraft. Come on, Jensen muttered as the dirt road ran out. Emily yanked the yoke, the Hercules clawing upward. For a breathless second, it felt too heavy, too slow. Then it lifted, wheels clearing the trees by inches. The aircraft surged skyward, fire erupting below. They were airborne, but it wasn't over. Alarms screamed, Incoming! Jensen yelled. Another missile streaked toward them. Emily banked hard, flares streaking behind. The missile chased. Heat veered and exploded off their wingtip, rocking the Hercules like a toy. Inside, the SEALs held Rourke down, patching wounds, shouting over the chaos. Hayes grabbed the intercom. Pilot, you just bought us another day. Now get us the hell home. Emily gritted her teeth, eyes locked on the night sky ahead. Roger that. Hold tight. The Hercules roared into the darkness, battered but unbroken, carrying its precious cargo out of hell. The Hercules clawed through the night sky, heavy with men, weapons, and a battered Navy SEAL commander. In the cockpit, Emily's knuckles whitened around the yoke, sweat dripping down her temple. The roar of the engines was steady for now, but she felt every vibration as though the aircraft itself was holding its breath. Altitude stable, Jensen said, scanning his gauges. Climbing past 5,000 feet. Emily exhaled, forcing calm. Good. Keep her steady. In the back, chaos. Rained. Medics crouched over Commander Rourke, who lay strapped to a stretcher, blood soaking his fatigues. Hayes barked orders, his voice carrying over the thrum of the engines. The SEALs were tense, eyes flicking to the ramp, weapons still clutched tight. Nobody trusted that the danger was behind them. And it wasn't. The radar lit up. A warning chime pierced the cockpit. "Contact fast movers inbound," Jensen said, voice clipped. His fingers flew over the radar display. 2 bogies, 20 miles out, closing fast. Emily's chest tightened. Fighter jets. Enemy aircraft had scrambled, and they were gunning. Straight for her. "They've got us tagged?" she asked. Jensen's silence was answer enough. Emily flicked the intercom. "Everyone brace. We've got company." The Hercules was not built for air combat. It was a lumbering beast, slow compared to fighters, sluggish in turns. Against 2 supersonic jets, her odds were slim to none. But slim was still better than none. "Ruiz," Emily barked, "get those countermeasures armed. We'll need every flare we've got." "Already on it," Ruiz replied grimly from the crew station. The night outside was silent, deceptive, but Emily knew death was slicing through the air toward them. She steadied her breathing, heart thundering in her chest. "Jensen, what's their distance?" 16 miles and closing. Mach 1 plus. "Damn," Emily muttered. "All right. We're not outrunning them. We're outthinking them." Hayes appeared in the cockpit, helmet still strapped on, rifle slung. "What's going on?" "Enemy jets inbound," Emily answered without looking at him. "They'll be here in 2 minutes." Hayes's jaw clenched. He glanced at the instrument panel as though he could decipher it, and back at Emily. "Options?" Emily's eyes didn't waver from the sky. "We go high, we're visible. We stay low, we hug terrain. Maybe, we lose them on radar. But in this bird, it's a coin flip." Hayes studied her face. She was calm. Not unafraid, but calm, as though fear had no room inside her. He nodded once. "Do what you have to. Just get us home." Emily's lips pressed tight. That was always the mission. Get them home. 10 miles, Jensen reported. His voice cracked slightly. Emily shoved the throttles forward. The Hercules groaned, engines straining, altitude dropping as she dove toward the mountains below. The valley walls loomed again, jagged silhouettes. "In the dark? You're taking us into the canyons again?" Jensen's voice pitched high. "Exactly," Emily said. "They want us? They'll have to come down here and fight on my terms." The altimeter spun. Wind buffeted the fuselage, turbulence slamming them side to side. The SEALs in the back cursed as gear rattled and Rourke groaned in pain. "Altitude 1,000 feet, Jensen shouted. Emily gritted her teeth. "Hang on." The Hercules threaded. The valley floor, wings tilting dangerously close to the ridges. Her eyes flicked from the radar to the windshield, memorizing every contour, every shadow. And then she saw them. 2 sleek shapes screamed overhead, engines howling, contrails streaking across the stars. The fighters looped, banking hard, coming. "Back for another pass. Bogies have visual," Jensen confirmed. "Here we go," Emily whispered. The first missile streaked toward them, a lance of fire cutting the sky. "Missile lock," Ruiz bellowed. Emily slammed the yoke left, dropping altitude hard. The Hercules shuddered, groaned, metal straining. Flares exploded behind them, streaking bright white against the darkness. The missile veered, chasing the heat, detonating harmlessly above. The shockwave rattled the fuselage, sending shivers down the controls. The SEALs held tight, eyes wide. Hayes braced against the cockpit door, watching Emily's hands blur across. "The instruments. You just dodged a fighter's missile in a transport plane," he muttered, almost in disbelief. Emily's eyes were steel. "Don't thank me yet. They're not done." The fighters dove again, splitting formation. One swept left, the other right, flanking them. Emily's stomach knotted. They were trying to box her in. Options? Jensen asked. Only one, Emily said. We go where they can't. She yanked the yoke, plunging the Hercules deeper into the canyon. Rock walls loomed, sheer cliffs rising on either side. The aircraft shimmied, buffeted by violent crosswinds, but Emily held it steady, eyes burning with focus. The fighters dove low to follow. Ma'am, they'll eat us alive down here, Jensen hissed. Not if the canyon eats them first, Emily replied. The roar of engines filled the sky. The fighters closed in, their cannons spitting tracer. Fire. Orange streaks tore past the Hercules, ripping chunks from the fuselage. Metal screamed. Panels rattled loose. One round punched through the cargo bay, ricocheting off steel. Damage on the left wing, Ruiz shouted. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. Emily didn't flinch. She banked hard right, scraping. Along the canyon wall, so close the wings nearly brushed rock. The fighters tried to mimic, but their speed was too great. One overshot, forced to pull up sharply. Emily smiled grimly. Too fast for their own good. The second fighter swooped low, lining up for another missile lock. Flares recharged. Ruiz called. Not yet, Emily said sharply. Wait. For my mark. The fighter closed. Beeping filled the cockpit. Mark, Emily shouted. Flares burst behind him. The missile streaked, then spun wildly, slamming into the canyon wall. A fireball lit the sky, rock and flame showering down. The Hercules rocked violently, debris clattering against its wings, but held. Jensen gaped. You just made him blow himself up. Emily's jaw was tight. One down. But the second fighter was still on their tail. It dove low, spitting cannon fire. More rounds tore through the fuselage, sparks showering. In the Aztay cargo hold, a SEAL screamed as shrapnel tore across his arm. Medics swarmed him, blood spraying. Hayes grabbed the intercom. Pilot, we're taking hits. We can't survive another pass. Emily's hands were steady, eyes locked on the canyon. Ahead. Then we won't give them another pass. She shoved the throttles forward, engines howling. The Hercules surged, lumbering faster through the canyon. Ahead, the walls narrowed, jagged spires clawing toward the stars. Emily, that's a dead end, Jensen shouted. Not for us, she growled. The canyon pinched tighter. The fighter dove in pursuit, missiles primed. Emily waited, every nerve taut. At the last second, she yanked the yoke, pulling the Hercules into a near-impossible climb. The aircraft scraped the canyon edge, sparks flying from the wingtip. The fighter tried to follow too late. It smashed against the canyon wall in a hamal, blinding fireball, exploding into shards of flame. The shockwave rocked the Hercules, alarm shrieking, but they were still flying. Emily exhaled slowly. Two down. For a moment, silence reigned. Only the engines hummed, ragged but alive. In the back, the SEALs erupted into cheers, slapping each other's shoulders. Even Hayes, grim as ever, allowed a small smile. He leaned into the cockpit. You just outflew 2 jets in a transport plane. Emily's hands trembled slightly on the yoke, though her voice was calm. We're not out yet. Let's get back to friendly airspace before they send more. Jensen looked at her in awe. Ma'am, you're not just a transport pilot. Not anymore. Emily didn't reply. She couldn't. Not with her heart pounding so violently. It felt like it might break her ribs. But in the silence of her own mind, she admitted something. She'd never dared before. She wasn't just delivering cargo anymore. She was delivering lives, and tonight she'd save them. Hours later, the horizon burned faintly with dawn. The Hercules, battered and scarred, limped toward the border where friendly fighters now swept overhead to escort them home. Emily sagged. In her seat, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. Behind her, Rourke stirred weakly on his stretcher, his lips moving. Hayes crouched down, listening. Then he turned toward the cockpit and said softly, "He wants to thank the pilot." Emily's throat tightened. She blinked hard, eyes on the rising sun. Not yet, she thought. Not until they were home. And so she gripped the yoke once more, guiding her wounded bird toward safety, every nerve burning, every breath a reminder. Survival was earned, not given. The Hercules groaned like an old warhorse as it limped across the border. Its skin was torn, scorched, and punctured, but its engines held. For the first time in hours, Emily allowed herself to ease her grip on the yoke. She flexed her stiff fingers and felt the ache radiate all the way up her arms. "Crossing into friendly airspace now," Jensen announced, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. He rubbed his eyes, as if making sure the radar wasn't playing tricks. On cue, a pair of American F-18s slid into formation beside them, their sleek silhouettes shimmering in the morning sun. A crackle filled the radio. "This is Falcon Lead. Hercules, you're clear. We've got you." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. For hours, she had carried the impossible weight of survival alone. Now, for the first time, she wasn't alone in the skies. She swallowed hard, answering, "Copy that, Falcon. Good to see you." In the cargo bay, a ragged cheer erupted. The SEALs slapped backs, voices hoarse but alive. Even Hayes, normally stone-faced, allowed himself a rare grin. But the victory was laced with shadows. Blood stained the deck. 2 SEALs lay wounded, one unconscious, another groaning as medics worked feverishly. And on the stretcher near the forward bulkhead, Commander Rourke hovered between life and death, his chest rising shallowly beneath a blood-soaked bandage. Emily forced herself to focus. The mission wasn't over until they touched down. They landed at a forward operating base just after sunrise. The runway stretched out like salvation, lined with ambulances and armed personnel. The moment the Hercules wheels screeched against the tarmac, Emily felt the first true rush of relief. She guided the battered bird to a stop, engines winding. Down into silence. The ramp dropped with a groan. Medics swarmed aboard, rushing to Rourke and the other injured. Hayes barked orders, helping lift the commander's stretcher down. Emily sat in the cockpit a moment longer, hands still resting on the controls. Her body trembled, every muscle aching. She realized she hadn't moved in nearly 10 hours. "You good, ma'am?" Jensen asked quietly, turning toward her. She gave a small nod, though her throat felt thick. "Yeah, just give me a second." A cockpit smelled of sweat, fuel, and scorched metal. For a fleeting moment, Emily let her forehead rest against the yoke. She closed her eyes. They were alive. Against every odd, they were alive. The debrief began within the hour. Emily sat in a stark room, her flight suit still streaked with grime and blood. Across the table sat Colonel Merrick, the base commander, flanked by intelligence officers. Their eyes were sharp, pens scratching across notepads as they asked question after question. "Start from the beginning," Merrick said, voice clipped. "You were assigned a routine exfil. At what point did you deviate from flight plan?" Emily described it all. The ambush, the scramble to rescue the SEALs, the decision to land in a hostile valley. She spoke clearly, without embellishment, her voice steady. But when she reached the part about the dogfight, the room shifted. "You're telling us you evaded 2 hostile fighter aircraft in a C-130? One officer asked skeptically, raising an eyebrow. Emily met his gaze squarely. "Yes, sir. I evaded them. And I destroyed them both." Merrick's pen paused mid-scratch. The officers exchanged glances, murmuring. "Ma'am," the skeptical officer said, "with all due respect that borders on, she's telling the truth." The voice came from the doorway. Hayes stood there, arms crossed, face carved from stone. His presence was enough to silence the room. "I was on board," Hayes continued. "I watched her fly that bird like nothing I've ever seen. She saved every damn one of us. Without her, we'd be body bags right now." Emily stiffened at the blunt praise, but Hayes wasn't done. He stepped closer, voice firm. "You want to write a report? Fine, write it. But don't sit there and act like she didn't just pull off the impossible." Silence stretched. Finally, Merrick leaned back, studying Emily. His expression was unreadable. "Very well," he said. "We'll corroborate with radar logs. But for now, dismissed, Captain Harper." Outside, Emily exhaled, the tension bleeding from her shoulders. Hayes fell into step beside her. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Hayes shook his head. "Yeah, I did. I've buried too many good men because someone in a chair didn't believe what happened in the field. Not this time." Emily gave a faint smile. "Thanks." They walked in silence for a while, the morning sun hot against the base's concrete. Finally, Hayes spoke again. "Rourke's stable," he said. "They've got him in surgery, but the docs think he'll make it." Emily stopped walking. Relief punched through her chest, so suddenly she had to sit down on a nearby bench. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding on to that weight until it lifted. Hayes studied her quietly. "You care," he said softly, almost surprised. Emily's gaze flicked up. "Of course I care. I had his life in my hands." Hayes tilted his head. "Not just his. You had all of ours." That night, sleep didn't come easy. Emily lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, every moment of the mission replaying in brutal detail. The canyon walls flashing past, the roar of missiles, the sound of Rourke's ragged breathing. She had survived. But survival carried its own weight. She thought of the men who hadn't made it, the SEAL who died before they could reach him, the countless others in missions across the globe. Emily had always told herself she was just a transport pilot. She delivered cargo, ferried troops, stayed out of the fight, but tonight shattered that illusion. She wasn't just delivering crates anymore. She was delivering lives, balancing them on the edge of her own skill and nerve. And once you crossed that line, there was no going back. 2 days later, she found herself standing outside the medical ward. The antiseptic smell hit her as she stepped inside, the low hum of machines filling the quiet hall. Rourke lay in a bed near the window, his chest bandaged, tubes running to 4 bags. He looked older now, his face pale and drawn. But when his eyes opened, they were sharp. "You're the pilot," he rasped. Emily nodded, pulling a chair closer. "Captain Harper, Emily." He studied her a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Finally, he said, "You saved my life." Emily shifted, uncomfortably. "You saved mine first. Without your team, I wouldn't have gotten out of that valley." Rourke gave a faint smile, though it looked painful. "Maybe so, but I've been in this game a long time. I've seen good men die because someone hesitated, or panicked, or froze. You didn't. You flew that bird like it was an extension of yourself. That wasn't luck. That was guts." Emily didn't know what to say. Praise from a man like Rourke carried a gravity she hadn't prepared for. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Don't ever let anyone call you just a transport pilot again. You're more than that. We all know it now." Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to say she'd only done her job, but the words caught. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Something had changed in her, something permanent, Outside the ward, Hayes waited. When Emily emerged, he raised an eyebrow. "How is he?" Emily drew a deep breath, then exhaled. "Tough as nails. He'll pull through." Hayes gave a short nod. Then he looked at her, really looked, and said, "So will you? Even if you don't believe it yet." For the first time since the mission, Emily allowed herself a small, genuine smile. The war wasn't over. Missions would come, dangers would follow, but she had faced fire in the skies and walked away stronger. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew she'd never again be content being just a transport pilot. She was something more now, something forged in the crucible of battle, recognized by warriors who had seen her in the storm. And there was no turning back. The desert airstrip stretched out beneath a pale morning sun. The Hercules sat off to the side, scarred and battered, its once proud frame pocked with burn marks and patched holes. Mechanics swarmed it, measuring, welding, tightening, arguing. In clipped voices over whether the old bird would ever fly again. Emily Harper stood a few yards away, hands tucked into the pockets of her flight suit. She hadn't been cleared for another mission yet, but she couldn't seem to pull herself away from the plane. Watching it, she felt like she was staring into a mirror, a survivor that bore every scar openly. You staring at her, or trying to figure out how she's still in one piece. Emily turned to see Hayes approach, his steps heavy but steady. He carried 2 cups of burnt base coffee, offering one out. She accepted it, wincing at the first bitter sip. "Both," she said softly. She should have been blown out of the sky. But somehow she kept going. Hayes nodded, gaze fixed. "On the Hercules. So did you." Emily gave a faint smile. Compliments still sat uncomfortably on her shoulders. But Hayes meant it. He wasn't one for empty words. 2 weeks had passed since the mission, and the world had not been quiet. The story of the ambush had reached higher commands. Not all of it. The details were classified, filed away in reports that would probably never see daylight, but enough had filtered out. There were whispers in the halls, of the transport pilot who'd gone toe-to-toe with enemy fighters, of the woman who had landed in a death trap and come back alive with an entire SEAL team and their commander. Whispers that carried a weight Emily wasn't ready for. Some called it heroism. Others called it recklessness. The truth, Emily knew, lived in a messy place in between. The first time she saw Rourke after surgery, he was sitting upright, pale but awake. The lines of pain etched into his face hadn't erased the steel in his eyes. "You again," he said when she stepped into the ward. "Me again," Emily replied. Rourke studied her for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he said, "You have any idea what you've done?" Emily frowned. "I saved your life, saved the team's. That's what matters." Rourke shook his head slightly. "That's the surface. Underneath, you've rattled cages. You made decisions most people would have frozen on. And you won." Emily shifted uneasily. It wasn't about winning. It was about surviving. "Exactly," Rourke said, his voice low. "And survival isn't luck. It's skill, courage, instinct. You've got all 3. And that makes people uncomfortable, especially the ones who've been underestimating you." Emily blinked. She wasn't used to hearing things spelled out so bluntly. Rourke leaned back, closing his eyes. "Briefly, you'll see. You've stepped out of the shadows now. You're not invisible anymore." His words echoed days later, when Emily was summoned to headquarters. The room was different this time. Not a debrief, a recognition. Higher-ranking officers sat at the table, their uniforms crisp, medals gleaming. Colonel Merrick introduced her with clipped formality. "Captain Harper," one general said, "your actions in the last operation have been reviewed. The risks you took and the success you achieved will not be forgotten." He slid a folder across the table. Inside lay the paperwork, commendations, a medal recommendation. Emily stared at it, numb. A medal. For doing what had to be done. She felt the weight of it pressing on her chest, heavier than any medal could ever be. "Sir," she said carefully, "with respect, I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because lives were on the line." The general nodded. "That's exactly why you deserve it." That night, Emily sat outside the barracks, staring at the desert stars. She held the paperwork in her lap, still unopened. Hayes joined her quietly, lowering himself onto the step beside her. "Heard the brass finally gave you their blessing." Emily gave a dry laugh. "Something like that. Feels strange. They want to pin a medal on me for not letting a plane full of people die." Hayes sipped from a flask he'd smuggled out, passing it over. Emily took a small swig, wincing at the burn. "You know what I think?" Hayes said. "I think medals don't mean much. But I also think you've earned every damn one they want to throw at you. Because what you did out there, no one else could have pulled it off. And deep down, you know that." Emily was quiet for a long time. Finally, she whispered, "I was terrified, Hayes. Every second, I thought I'd fail them." Hayes shook his head. "Doesn't matter. You didn't. That's what counts." When Rourke was finally cleared for travel, Emily was at the runway again, watching as he boarded a medical transport back to the States. He paused at the ramp, turning to look at her. "Harper," he called, his voice carrying across the tarmac. "Remember this. You weren't just a transport pilot then, and you're not now. Don't let anyone put you back in that box." Emily gave a small nod, throat tight. Weeks later, the Hercules was back in service, its scars covered by fresh panels. Emily climbed into the cockpit once more, the familiar scent of oil and metal wrapping around her. Her crew settled in, Jensen grinning, Diaz muttering about coffee, the hum of routine settling like a blanket. But something inside Emily had shifted permanently. Every switch she flipped, every lever she touched, felt heavier now. Not just because of what had happened, but because of what it meant. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the pilot in the background. She was the one they looked to when the sky caught fire. And she realized she wanted that responsibility. The Hercules rumbled down the runway, lifting into the endless blue. Emily steadied the controls, her eyes scanning the horizon. There would be more missions, more danger, more shadows waiting out there. But she was ready. Because she was no longer only a transport pilot. She was the one they called when everything went wrong. And she would never let them down.